My name is Zlatko Lagumdžija. Ismail is taking order of everyone who is not sitting. So that's the reason why I have a chance to actually being listened before our distinguished panelists start speaking. The name of this session is titled two times. Once it was titled in previous program, and then it was titled in a current program. But in both ways, it is on political parties. In first draft of the program, it was titled about political parties in Europe. And of course, it's renamed because it's political parties on the West, which means that it's not only Europe, it's also what is happening in the western part of West, with this particular moment is United States of America. And our panelists are reflecting that as well. I already had, I have to tell you the secret, I mean, I had a problem how to introduce Jerry, or Gary, Jones, our American friend, if it was titled only to be speaking about Europe. But since I'm coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we are a country which was, after long bleeding and even genocide, the last genocide in the end of 20th century in Srebrenica, the war was stopped with Dayton Peace Accord, and our Constitution is made in Dayton, which is still in the United States of America. And we have sometimes a feeling, especially with latest developments, that the United States of America are still, for us in Bosnia, the most important European country. But anyway, since Jerry is coming from the United States, after our two friends and colleagues who are coming from old Europe, the real Europe, Rob Reinemann, who is a Dutch writer, who is speaking and writing extensively about especially the things that are unfortunately getting stronger in the European Union, which is populism, fascism, nationalism, different phobias, and so on and so on. We were supposed to have another Dutchman today, Wim Kok, my colleague and friend from Club de Madrid, Prime Minister of Holland. I'm very unfortunate, like I'm sure all of us, that he's not here today with us, because he's one of the my colleagues who I learned a lot from. And speaking about political parties and politicians, I remember that once when we were in Egypt in one Club de Madrid mission and project about 7-8 years ago together, he told me, Zlatko, since you're much younger than me, I have one advice for you. If you want to really not hate yourself after you leave the politics, you have to keep understanding that when you are confronted with a dilemma, being respected or being popular, be respected. And I learned that lesson a lot. Second time when I reminded him of that, he said, Zlatko, don't overdo it. Because if you are a political leader, you have to be also popular, because otherwise people will not recognize that they should respect you as well. Anyway, what we will today, and of course our third speaker is another European, gentleman Bjorn Borg, Berger, who is coming from Norway with long experience in foreign policy, but he's now Deputy Secretary General and Director of the Private Office of General Secretary of Council of Europe. Council of Europe is the Parliamentary Assembly. Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe is bigger Europe. It's much bigger Europe than today's Europe when we say Europe. And that's why Council of Europe, since they don't have so much operational political decisions like European Parliament, which is about European Union, that's the reason why Council of Europe is, to a lot of people, known as a moral parliament of Europe, of the real values of European Union, because sometimes European Union, especially recently, we are witnessing that the European Union is much more guided with interest than with values that it is about. Now, what we will, in order to frame this session, we will try to tackle 3 points. First one is, how do we change when we talk about political parties? What do political parties have to change? And in order to see what changes we need, we'll probably need to talk a little bit about need for change and anticipate certain things that are relevant for the change. And the third element is how to lead those changes. Second issue should be what would be the model of leading changes in the sense of what is the role of political parties in those changes and how those political parties change. Of course, in order to do so, the third point which we would like to let's tackle a little bit is what are the ways that political parties as a tool for certain political goals and tool of democracy. One, so far, the biggest tool of democratic institutions that are outside of those institutions, how to match the dilemma in between the values that they promote and interests that they do represent. In order to anticipate what are the changes, I would just like to give one short bullet lists about the changes that we have to take in consideration when we talk about political parties. I was talking to some friends in here, when you do read about democracy, of course you can go as far as ancient Greece, and democracy is when indigent and not the men of property are rulers. Quote from Aristotle. Now, today, one of the three big trends in politics, and especially that political parties have to take care about, is technology. When Aristotle was around, he did not have technology we have today. And one of the issues that we would like to also to tackle, and I'm sure that some of our speakers will do, is how the new technologies actually can change the political party's perspective. Let me put it this way. If today we are talking about social networks the way we do, if in 5 years from now there will be 100 million sensors on the internet, if in 10 years there will be 1 trillion sensors on the internet, if we will have 150, 60 sensors per one person, including 2 billion people who are still preparing their food on a wooden fire, if in 10 years from now some states will give up census because everything will be there in the moment they want, with overall presence of information technologies, with big data, with big storage, with smartphones being in the pockets of more than 90% of the population in the very near future, Aristotle would probably be able to explain how everyone can have a vote on anything, anytime, anywhere, in whatever constituency. Do we want that? We definitely do not. But finally, we have chance to feel Aristotelian dream, that every person can be part of decision. Representative democracy is definitely in crisis because of the facts that we are well aware of. Do we want to representative democracy to replace with everyone's being decision maker? Of course, I mean, this is typical democratic answer. No. Now, having said so, I remember when I was, after Dayton, being the guinea pig as a citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina, submitted to a lot of international community experiments. I remember at that time, whenever was the question, when we asked about destroyed country, about genocide, about war wounds, about anything, the answer from democratic world was, don't worry, you just have to have democracy, and you will flourish. Then 6 months later, after first wave, we said, okay, what we'll do about democracy, they had said, well, you'll have elections. So whatever was the question, the answer was elections. First 4 years, we had elections every year. Local one, general one, local one, general one, 2 years mandate, so on and so on. So whatever was the question, the answer was elections. Today, 20 years later, we understand that that's not what it's all about. We need a little bit more, and that's the reason why today we are much more focused on economy and rule of law. and I will stop in here. I will just ask my dear friends and colleagues to, we agreed that we will speak actually for 7 minutes, not giving up the option to speak for 10 minutes, but because they already have the answers, which I'm going to give them questions anyway. And of course, the answers they have do not necessarily relate to my questions, but they will give it anyway. So in order to make this more dynamic, we'll try to stick to 7 minutes. No one single minute will be taken away from you. You will have them, and in the end, more than 10 minutes of them. So today, the world is confronted, obviously, with a lot of dilemmas, a lot of issues, but democracy is not the goal. The goal is prosperity and sustainability of all of us, and the tool of democracy are political parties. How political parties will transform. How do they transform? When they are losing their power in Western democracies, how they will tackle the issue of new technology, social media, and so on as one element. And the third element, of course, how they will defend themselves from the big money that is just exploding. I'm sure that Jerry will say something about current attempt of Republican nominee, the guy who...
He's not going to make the nomination.
Okay. I said attempt of nominee. I said attempt of nominee. I mean, this is democracy. We have to give him a chance, right? Otherwise, America would not be... And of course, America will show that America by just having them being named as a... He was former future nominee. But that's another story. And the best example of big money is Europeans will also have to say something about it. If 12 years ago, 15 years ago, Al Gore was having a budget, presidential budget, in the area of $100 million, that was the biggest budget for elections in the United States at that time. 100 million was a magic number. He didn't get it, close to it, he was close. If 12 years later, American president hit over $1 billion in 12 years. So in the United States, I'm talking about the United States, pardon? It's over $1 billion. Is it 1.1 or 1.2? I don't think it makes sense. Makes difference, I'm sorry. It doesn't make sense as well, but it does make a difference. So if in 12 years it went 12 times more, regardless of financial crisis, and if next American president will be probably having the price tag of more than 1.5 billion in campaign, where are we going? Do you need just to raise the money? Do you just have to have a scarecrow that will go on? Well, those are the questions. So, Rob, you are the first one, right? Old Europe.
Thank you, Slatko. Well, the good news is that I read in the New York Times and the Washington Post that Mr. Bush spent already 50 million and it didn't give him any help. So he's still in single digits. And so money is no longer the biggest issue in America. Look, there are many excellencies here, I noticed. I guess that's due to the Club of Rome, of the Club of Madrid involved. And I'm sure that all of them realize better than anybody else that the term excellency is nothing else than a label. It doesn't say that they are excellent. It doesn't say they are doing an excellent job. Because if that would have been the case, we would not face the crisis of democracy. Now, the crisis of democracy relates to the same phenomenon. It became a label. It doesn't say anything. It's a complete meaningless word. And even I have to, I have to disappoint you, but even having a constitution or having a parliament is not a guarantee for democracy. Look at Russia. Russia has a constitution, it has a parliament, it's not a democracy. It's a police state ruled by an autocrat and who cannot even spell the word democracy. So what we have to recapture is the spirit of democracy. That's the key thing. The rest will follow. But if we cannot recapture the spirit of democracy, then all the rest is just nonsense. Now, if we talk about democracy, we talk about a way of government, a way of, the kind of ideal state related to our concern of how to live in a good society. In the 17th century, we had two great philosophers. In England, it was Thomas Hobbes. And according to Hobbes, the purpose of the state is to preserve peace through security and, if necessary, fear. That's the idea of Hobbes. And basically, it's the model of an autocratic state as we now see it in Russia, in Turkey, in Singapore, in China. At the same time, in my country, Spinoza was the Dutch Jewish philosopher Spinoza, who said the purpose of the state is freedom. The purpose of the state is freedom, with which he meant a rule of law, with which he meant a complete respect for individual rights, no constraints by religion. At the very moment that a religious establishment is still having a hold on your society, forget democracy. It's impossible, because a religious establishment makes any form of pluralism impossible. So Spinoza accepted the fact that he was banned from his Jewish community. He could live with that. He also realized that all of this is necessary for us to become free in the sense that we can rid of our own stupidities, our own prejudices, our own fears, our own greeds, whatever. Only then you're capable to say, I'm a free man or woman. And he realized this can only be achieved if there is a political democracy. Only then people can really live in freedom. Fast forward 1938. The Dutch novelist, Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann starts living in the United States of America. Around World War I, he was a true nationalist. He believed in the emperor. He hated democracy because he thought democracy is vulgar, blah, blah, blah. But then Hitler came on the horizon, and he started to realize that he made a tremendous mistake. That the only way to keep up his spiritual values, you have to have democracy. So he was exiled in 1933. He went to America. He became a close friend of Franklin Roosevelt. He was in the White House many times. And on behalf of Roosevelt, or to do him a favor, he went on a town hall tour, giving a lecture, The Coming Victory of Democracy. And he gave this lecture in 15 towns for more than 10,000 people every time. I want to give you 3 quotes. First of all, he said, democracy is that form of government and society which is inspired above every other with feeling and consciousness of the dignity of man. That's the true spirit of democracy. It's a government that is inspired by the feeling and consciousness for the dignity of man. That's the key thing. Then he explains this dignity. He says, the great and honorable in men manifest themselves as art and science, passion for truth, creation of beauty, and the idea of justice. This is what the dignity of man is all about. Truth, beauty, justice. And as a conclusion, I quote, democracy wishes to elevate mankind, to teach it to think, to set it free. It seeks to remove from culture the stamp of privilege and disseminate it among the people. In one word, it aims at education. So there it is again, our magical word. We have heard it since the very beginning of this conference. Education as the guardian of democracy. Now, we all know that the West claims to have the best education. And many of you, definitely when you are part of the upper class, you can only dream that your kids can be sent to Harvard or Yale or MIT or Oxford or Cambridge or the Sorbonne, because then they will have a proper, very good education. If that is true, if the West indeed is having the best education in the world, then how come that we are facing the return of fascism everywhere in the West? In my country, the Netherlands, Mr. Wilders, he's a fascist, he's #1 in the polls. Le Pen, a fascist, France. Mr. Orban, accepted fascist, but we have a Christian nation, we will build the wall, we cannot have those Islamic people in our Christian nation, a fascist. We see it in Spain, we see it in Italy, and of course in the United States of America. And look, Mr. Trump, you know, at least the Americans are are brave enough to admit that they have a homegrown fascist, but the rest of the GOP is not that much different. Whether it's Mr. Carson or Mr. Rubio, it's a great lineup of complete bullshitters, all of them. Why? Well, because it is not true. The West is not offering the best education in the world. It's a lie. It's a big, big lie. It's not the education Thomas Mann has in mind when he says, look, we have to have education to live in truth, to do justice, to create beauty, to gain wisdom, to learn the language of the muses, to be a free citizen. This also explains the financial crisis. I mean, we have this idea that the financial crisis is started at Mars or one of a strange planet and that it hit us. No, it's a man-made thing. People are responsible for this financial crisis who had millions and millions and millions of people all over the world. And a huge majority of those people are educated, guess what, at Harvard, Yale, etc. Okay, well, unfortunately, this was to be expected, because in 1870, the German philosopher Nietzsche, as a young professor, gave a lecture, 5 lectures on the future of education. And already then he said to his students, he said, I pity you. Because the time that university was a kind of school of civilization is over. Your education will be reduced to what is good for the economy and what's good for bureaucracy. That's it. 1870. Almost 150 years ago. And indeed, what are we doing? We are training consultants and bureaucrats and accountants. They all have to be smart. Smart is the new thing. You know, we need smart this, smart so. But indeed, the whole notion of wisdom is gone. We are dealing with organized stupidity. And organized stupidity doesn't mean that all those stupid people are not intelligent. Some of them are extremely intelligent. They are professors, they are great academics, they are whatever. They are excellent. His or her excellency. No, but there are fundamental things they do not know. It was never part of their education. Now, there is a common knowledge, even based on scientific research. There is a great book of Gaetano Mosca, The Ruling Class, which has figured out from the Babylonians till now that the ruling class is always an expression of the society as it is. That seems to me self-evident. They incarnate the values of that society. That's why are they the ruling class. But the important consequence of this is that the ruling class, the power elites, don't have any incentive to change our world. Because they will lose their position. At the very moment we really have a drastic change in our society, they are the first one to go. So, they will not solve the crisis, they are the crisis. They are the incarnation of the crisis, they are the incarnation of the crisis of democracy. How does this relate to the phenomenon of political parties? Political parties are a quite recent phenomenon. Max Weber, it was mentioned before, has something like, well, you know, we need a strong parliament to deal with the monarch and to control bureaucracy. But he already realized that, you know, that he was looking for a square circle, because to have a strong parliament, you also need to have, you know, a charismatic political leader. If that would not be the case, then you would end up in a situation where the party bureaucrats will win and eventually the party or democracy will collapse. And this is exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic. So not much later, you had 20 minutes. Not much later, there was an important French philosopher, Simone Weil. And Simone Weil in 1943 came with a very bold statement entitled On the Abolition of Political Parties. Just get rid of them, all of them. She said, well, you know, political parties are organizations that are publicly and officially designed for the purpose of killing in all souls the sense of truth and justice. And her arguments are extremely clear. First of all, parties are there to create collective passions instead of individual thinking. They are designed that the members of the party you have to obey. It's called party discipline. And the ultimate goal of the party is just to become the biggest party. And she has a wonderful example. She says, look, if somebody stands up and said, look, you know, I'm now chosen to serve my country, I will do everything to serve my country, irrespective of what the party thinks of it. You'll be gone in a second. Now, unfortunately, this is a universal phenomenon. It's not only the politics, it's in the world of academics, intellectuals, etc., etc., etc. But the problem is this: as long as young people are educated to adapt, to make money, to be impressed by power, to impressed by excellencies, to impressed by technology, to impressed by religion, we will not be free. There will not be democracy. So this is my conclusion. No science, no lottery, sorry Ismail, no religion, no army, no business world will help us unless first we encourage and make it possible that everybody, especially the young people, are educated to live in truth, to create beauty, to do justice, and to live their own life. To live their own life. Spinoza, at the end of his Ethics, writes, all things excellent are as difficult as rare. To live really an excellent life, that is to say, to cultivate the main virtues and to make the most important spiritual values your own, that is what excellency is all about. And without that form of excellency, there will be no democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. Now we have Jerry or Gary. When we spoke 2 months ago about this event with Ismail, Ismail gave us a little note about one of the ideas that was floating about replacement of political parties. And basically speaking, there was an idea that instead of having elections, people get elected like a jury get elected. At the same time, we were discussing about the role of new technologies. And that's the reason why we asked Jerry to come here as with two hats, so to speak. As a gentleman who runs the big ICT company, which is dealing with big data, with new technologies, but at the same time who is a lawyer and who knows a lot about juries. So, of course, he will say, as we can see, whatever he wants, but and as much as he wants, but I would ask him to, let's say, has his reflection on these two issues. The political parties not being replaced, but actually dismissed, and having parliaments elected as a juries. And what we will do with technology. Do we have chance? Are we making a decision about it? Or technology will just happen, whatever we do think? So, Jerry, please.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be here today. And I would note at first that the American definition of recency and a European definition of recency is a bit different. If political parties are as a recent origin, because we consider the mid-1700s as ancient history in our country, so we believe that we have had political parties in our country for quite some time. It's interesting to take just a moment and sort of trace the development of political parties in America and see how long various parties lasted and what they evolved into. In the beginning, we had the Federalist, and if you have the Federalist, you have to have the Anti-Federalist. And those were the actual two names of the two primary political parties at the institution of our nation. Then the Federalists kept their name, and then we had the Jeffersonian Republicans, who eventually evolved into a party that the Federalists joined as well. And so for a period of about 30 years or so in the early 1800s, we really had one dominant political party in the United States. During that period of time, the U.S. House of Representatives ended up picking the President of the United States twice because the people that were running did not receive a majority, and so the decision went to the United States House of Representatives. First, Thomas Jefferson, and it took 36 separate ballots within the House of Representatives to elect Thomas Jefferson president in his contest against Aaron Burr. And then about 20, 25 years later, John Quincy Adams was elected by the U.S. House of Representatives. As a result of that, the Jeffersonian Republicans split into the National Republicans and the Old Republicans. And the Old Republicans became the Jacksonian Democrats, with the Republicans being called Whigs for a period of time, with their party coming together pretty much in its modern format in the 1860s, and the Jacksonian Democrats becoming the ancestors of the Democratic Party, which came together in the mid-1880s. I was almost named Grover Cleveland after the first Democratic president who was elected after the Civil War in my country. My grandfather was named Grover Cleveland Jones. So I'm telling you that because I have a tinge of bias in my political leanings, and I'll just go ahead and put that up front. During my lifetime, the presidency, of course, in the United States has roughly been shared between the Democrats and the Republicans. I was born during the era of President Eisenhower. Then we had Kennedy, of course, and Johnson, of course, and then Nixon, then Ford for a period of time. We had Carter, and on and on. So roughly we have had 5 and 5 during my lifetime. So we have also had a change in the political makeup of Congress during my lifetime as well. The Democrats had a long-standing hold on Congress for around 60 years, 62 years, I believe, and then it switched for a period of time during the early years of the Clinton administration, which caused President Clinton to move to ways of cooperating with the other side of the aisle and figuring out how to get things done where power was truly split. The Democrats regained control, and then, of course, the Democrats lost control of the House and the Senate most recently in 2010. But the Democrats maintained control of the presidency. So we have a split of power that has worked relatively well in the United States. However, we have a decline in the public's view of the validity of the ability of the American political system to actually get things done. And the decline started many, many years ago, but it has gone from roughly 80% in 1961 down into the 20% level now, depending upon the division of the government that you want to look at, with some opinion polls showing that Congress is in single digits or is teetering on single digits with respect to the overall perspective. However, the reelection rate of individual members of Congress has remained at historic levels. So we kind of don't like the way the institution is working, but we tend to like our representative. One of the reasons that we like our representatives is the political system has allowed itself to be gerrymandered with respect to the U.S. House of Representatives, meaning that the districts are divided in such a manner that they either lean Democrat or liberal generally, or conservative or Republican generally, which means that there are safe seats. And we are also finding out that in America, we are not only gerrymandering our political divisions, we are somewhat self-selecting where we live, who we listen to, and our political discourse is such that we're tending to group up more with people who share like views. I suppose that's natural human behavior, but it does accentuate the political consequences of political gerrymandering. If you looked at a map of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives, as you know, is the body of government nationally in the U.S. that's supposed to be closest to the people because their terms are only 2 years, so they have to return to their home district frequently. But if you looked at a map of the United States of America and you colored it red for Republican and blue for Democrat, you would see that the vast area of the central part of the country is governed by Republicans. And if you look at the perimeter of the country, around the border, you would see that it is generally Democratic. But visually, if you look at that, you would say, oh my, the Republicans truly do control the United States of America. Yet, 2/3 of the U.S. population is within 100 miles of our borders. So if you weight it by population, it is not nearly as distorted. In terms of where this may take us, in terms of trust, trust is an essential ingredient to getting things done. If there is trust, almost anything is possible. If there is not trust, it is incredibly difficult to get things done. It used to be, in my country, that if there were 10 issues, the Democrats and the Republicans could agree upon 7 or 8 of those and get something done. But they wouldn't hold the other 2 or 3 hostage. Now, the 2 or 3 issues are holding 7 or 8 other issues hostage. This has manifested itself in the divisions over the budget of the United States, where the government has gotten shut down twice during the last 20 some odd years as a result of the inability to compromise on the federal budget. The last time the government was shut down, the Republicans were in control of the legislature. They refused to pass the budget. It got held up. Their popularity went way, way down. They were saved, however, by a computer glitch. The Affordable Health Care Act, a wonderful act providing insurance to people in America, when you went to sign up, the website did not work. It was a failure of technology. And all of a sudden, the public opinion swung back, and they ended up winning in very significant numbers in the next election. So briefly, to touch upon your point about data and political power and technology, my day job is with a public company that has a database on the entire economically active population in the United States, significant parts of Europe and other parts of the world. We know a tremendous amount about people. We bring together information about people. We could, if asked, redistrict the United States House of Representatives in an afternoon of computer time in all likelihood. That we would ever be asked to do that, we probably will not. But if we were to do that, and if we were to have contestable elections in the House of Representatives, it would force the political parties to find the common ground and get things done. Pew Research Center last year went back and looked at their polling data over the last 20 years on where is the median Democrat and the median Republican on a set of 10 issues, where do they skew out for those who are politically engaged and those who are not politically engaged. In 1994, the difference between the median Democrat and the median Republican was about like this. 10 years later, in 2004, it had barely moved. In 2014, the median for the politically engaged Democrat and Republican was like this, a dramatic gap. And yet, those who are not politically engaged in 1994 were like this. In 2004, they were like this. And in 2014, they were like this. The majority of Americans do not identify with any particular political party. So if you look at that research, what that tells me is that there is a very strong centrist perspective in the United States that is being pulled apart by our political process at the present time, with both parties acting to preserve the status quo in a sense. Now, I would like to address one matter of current political discourse emanating from the United States of America. And I know it is on the minds of everyone here. And Ishmael has told me that there is a rule not to attack the person, but to the extent that the person is the embodiment of their values and principles, I feel like I can walk very close to the line. I will be blunt. Donald Trump is a buffoon, and he shows it quite well. Quite well. The statements that he has made are dangerous. They need to be rejected. They should be rejected. I have faith in the common wisdom of the people of the United States, and I believe that they will be rejected. He is creating a very dangerous situation for political purposes. He is playing to fear and paranoia, And whenever a politician plays to fear and paranoia, it is a dangerous situation that absolutely has to be addressed and cannot be allowed to flourish. Cannot be allowed to flourish. He has the right to say what he is saying under our system, but I believe he is disqualifying himself as a person who could be capable of leading the United States of America and being a world leader. He is also playing into the hands of the terrorist, very much so, by saying what he is saying. It supports their narrative. America will reject what he is saying. We will reject it. He is also creating a problem for his own party with the comments that he is saying. The majority leader of the House of Representatives, Representative Ryan, has rejected what he has said. The Senate Chairman, Senator McConnell, has rejected what he is saying. Mayors all across the country are rejecting it. The other Republican candidates are trying to reject it as best they can, even though they have signed a loyalty pledge saying that they will support the nominee of their party. They're praying that he is not the nominee, and of course the Democrats are completely rejecting it. Major newspapers across the United States of America are rejecting what he is saying. Major newspapers.
Not Fox.
Yes, the people are rejecting it.
Fox?
Yes, absolutely. Watch the polls that come out over the next couple of weeks. The latest polls were conducted by Gallup right before he made the comments.
Just so here, 35% of the Republican Party support Trump, 66%, two-thirds of the American public at large find it offensive.
Yes. And the Gallup poll.
As of right now.
Yes,
This is
the latest
breaking news
Gallup.
from the New York Times.
Yeah, and that's probably citing the Gallup poll that came out 3 days ago. Their research was 3 days ago. But the polls that will come out, I believe, will show that we're a little bit smarter than he thinks that we are. If we had a negative vote as opposed to only a positive vote, think about what Dr. Ishmael just said. He'd be an also-ran. And if he rejects the Republican Party and he runs as an independent and tries to run as a third party, we know the results on that. We've run that experiment in America. Ross Perot in May and June before the general election in '92 was at 35%, roughly where Donald Trump has been within his own party, and he got like 18 or 19% in the general election. He will get squeezed out. He will be an afterthought. And there are more ways to vote than at the ballot box. There's economics as well. He's in the entertainment game. Let's reject his game. So I know I've gotten a bit political, but I make no apologies for what I have said.
Well, Gary, thank you very much. We agree to a certain extent that some people who are saying that American elections are most non-democratic elections in the world, because of a very simple reason. It's not fair that only 200 million people elect the president who will make decisions about the 6 or 7 billion people in the world. So in that context, that's something that we have to have in mind when we are talking about presidential candidate that is on fear and prejudice getting stronger and stronger, hoping and being sure that people will reject it. Of course, I would ask Mr. Berger to, among other things, to tell us a little bit more about Council of Europe role and how efficient and effective it is in actually making values being what matters still in a world in which values are being all over the world in different ways, and now we see in Europe also not seen for real. I mean, if in the European Union, the values, and Mr. Raymond was talking about Hungary as example, when it comes that interests are becoming so strong that they actually are hitting the very core of the values, we are getting into the very dangerous situation. And I have to say, something which was mentioned. Hungarian case is maybe the best case, showing how people can have double standards. Back in '56, in that Hungarian crisis, 200,000 Hungarians left mostly over Yugoslavia, left Hungary, 200,000. They became refugees in a few days. 150,000 of them were immediately, in less than 15 days, found their homes in Western Europe and some of them in Canada and United States. Now, the very same people, very same nation, who knows very well how it is to be a refugee running out of the Iron Curtain at that time. And today, we are witnessing what they are witnessing. I mean, Hungarians are probably the last ones in 20th century in Europe that had accepted wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the rest of Yugoslavia, who have right to act that way. But that's the reason why I would like that we have conscious of Europe to say a little bit more about how do we prevail values against interests which are getting stronger and stronger and leading us to fear and prejudice becoming our life.
Thank you, Chair. I will do that gladly, but I will first address the question of the session, which is about political parties in Europe. Dear friends, it is increasingly said that in Europe, the age of traditional party politics is over. The following evidence is usually cited. In many developed democracies, party membership is at an all-time low. In the United Kingdom, for example, in the 1950s, almost every household affiliated with either the Labour Party, traditionally the working class party of the North, or the Tories, the Conservatives, the white-collar party of the South. Today, however, fewer than 1% of people count themselves as members of a mainstream political party. Secondly, political parties are finding it harder and harder to engage young people. 30 years ago, 1 in every 3 members of Germany's Social Democratic Party was under 35 years. Today, it's more like 1 in 10. Third, the identity politics of the 20th century, in which people tended to back a team or support a party program, has increasingly been replaced by single-issue politics, in which individuals congregate around distinct campaigns. This trend has been visible since the 1970s, when we saw a boom in environmentalism, the growth of anti-nuclear movement, and the then new interest in international aid and development. Fourth, the internet and social media have consolidated this trend even further. Between 2007 and 2013, Change.org, the hugely successful online petition platform, attracted over 224 million online signatures across 196 countries, leading to all manner of social reforms, from getting Apple to agree to better working conditions for its Chinese workers, to getting big profit magazines, fashion magazines, to stop digitally enhancing photos of teenage models, to having the first ever female moderator being chosen for an American presidential debate. Each of these campaigns attracted huge amount of attention, as do many others every day. Fifth, and the growth of single-issue parties, such as the Greens in Germany and more lately in Norway, and of the populist, more politically extreme parties from both left and right, like Sweden's Sverigedemokraterna, France's Front National, Hungary's Jobbik, and so on, can also be seen as a rejection of mainstream party politics. Yes, there are political parties too. They are political parties too, but they deliberately run on narrow platforms which seek to exclude those who do not agree with them, unlike their mainstream counterparts who tend to offer more comprehensive consensual programs for government. All of these 5 observations are true. In many countries, there is now a growing gap between traditional parties and the societies they are meant to represent. I think Dr. Sarah Geldin showed us some very interesting and important facts and figures yesterday. In many ways, the heart of the matter is that our societies no longer divide along the same lines as they used to. In the past, your family was well off or hard up. You lived in a good neighborhood or you lived in a bad one. You joined a profession or else left school and took a low-paid job. And you usually led a fairly similar life to your mother and father, as your children would after you. This was how things stayed. Identity was passed down from one generation to the next. Yet today, our lives are much more fluid and our identities much more complex. We travel and relocate more than ever before. We marry people from different backgrounds and cultures. We go to college or university and forge different paths to our parents. Through new technologies, we are exposed to worlds that are a million miles apart from our own. In short, we no longer fit into neat little boxes. And this is a challenge for the traditional party mold. The question is, what do we do about it? And here I would like to offer a word of caution. There are 3 dangers that come with accepting that Europe has entered into a post-partisan age, and that this is the end of the story. First, declaring the end of party politics exaggerates our social homogeneity, and this is bad for democracy. Lurking behind and beneath the claim that in mature democracies, party politics has had its day, it's a Fukuyama-type notion that history is over. The idea that our modern European societies have become so advanced or well-developed on an evolutionary society ladder that the major ideological battles have been removed and we no longer require very different political alternatives. Or we do not seek radical change. But we should be extremely wary of downplaying the diversity within our societies and the great many differences that remain. Indeed, perhaps if Europe had been more alive to these many differences, we would not have been quite as caught off guard by the growing problem of radicalization among marginalized Muslim youth and the phenomenon of homegrown terrorism. And we must remember that political pluralism and the genuine competition of ideas, for which traditional parties still remain the best vehicle, is central to a society's ability to adapt and embrace change. Without it, societies stagnate and collapse and look no further than the former Soviet Union for proof. Second, declaring the end of party politics tends to be a Western European perspective, and should not distract us from the need for strong opposition parties able to hold executive power in check. There are in many countries in Europe and elsewhere where the hunger for plural political landscapes and meaningful opposition is alive and kicking, where, far from turning away from political parties, people are seeking political alternatives and strong opposition parties. This is clearly the case in some of the younger or transitional democracies we work with in the Council of Europe, for example in Ukraine, or for that sake in Georgia. And on this point, no state can be complacent, including older democracies too. Even in countries which are generally perceived as having effective multi-party systems, arrangements still often favor incumbent politicians and hinder the ability of opposition parties to hold government to account. We see this, for example, with regard to rules governing party financing or regulations governing media ownership. So we aim to help all of our member states improve the conditions for opposition parties. 3, declaring the end of party politics get the politicians off the hook. Just because people do not pay their subscription every month to attend their local party meeting does not mean that they are not publicly spirited or socially minded. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw hundreds of thousands of demonstrators take to the streets in cities across the world to demand that their leaders find an agreement to climate change ahead of the summit in Paris. In previous marches, those numbers have hit the millions, including in the anti-terror marches which followed the Charlie Hebdo shooting, and also to protest the 2003 war in Iraq. When local matters are at stake, we often see communities galvanize. In Norway, this is very much the case when, for example, local hospitals are threatened with closure. And in situations when people really believe that they can influence the big, important decisions, they come out in their droves, in mature democracies too. Just take last year's referendum on Scottish independence, which saw an unprecedented proportion of people cast their ballot to determine the fate of their nation. 85%, including many young men and women, because the franchise had been extended to include also 16 and 17 years old. The onus should therefore be on political parties to tap into this social and political consciousness. How, you may ask? Well, let me mention 3 quick suggestions. First of all, parties need to change their organizational processes and structures in order to become more representative. It is hardly surprising that young activists are turned off when the parties on offer are so overwhelmingly male and pale. How can we get women more engaged and active in political life? In Norway, in my own country, they are very active and has been active for many years. But that does not mean it is the same situation all over Europe. As a matter of fact, it's not. Secondly, parties need to talk about the issues people care about. Nowhere has the failure to do this by the mainstream been so obvious than on immigration. All of the polls will tell you that across Europe, immigration frequently rates as one of our citizens' top 3 electoral concerns. Yet, up until a few years ago, parties kept quiet on the issue, out of fear that they couldn't offer the hardline answers that they believed the people wanted to hear. Instead of reasoned and open debate, we had a kind of conspiracy of silence, and as a result, a vacuum was created that has since been filled by populists and petty nationalists, and now we are feeling the consequences. And finally, parties need to do more to harness the internet to reach out to citizens. You raised the issue, Chair, and I think Jerry also referred to it. Anyone who thinks it can't be done should ask President Obama. 2008 will long be remembered as the Facebook election, and for good reason. Over the course of the campaign, the president reached 5 million voters across 15 social networking sites in what was the most ambitious and integrated web campaign by any politician. The results were clear on election night when the exit polls revealed that Obama had won 70% of the under 25 years olds, the highest proportion since polling began in 1976. So to conclude, yes, there is a gap between traditional parties and modern European citizens, but it is a gap we should try to bridge. We live in diverse societies where robust opposition and political pluralism are the lifeblood of a vibrant and dynamic democracy. Political parties continue to be best means to this end. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we pass the floor to the questions, I would just have quick 2 questions for each of our panelists to reflect shortly on 2 questions which came out from this introductory speeches. First question is, what do you think are social media and technologies? Much more fertile ground for parties that are shared society and hope parties, or segregated society and fear parties? And what the first ones, because basically speaking, that's what most of us promote, what the first ones should do to use that new issue. And the second question, you can, all of you, answer about 2 questions at once, or before one after another. 2020 is a year when we will have a newly elected president in the United States. 2020 is a year when EU 2020 strategy is going to be finished and the new period will come. So what do you think that will be the major differences of the parties in your countries, in states, or in Europe by that time, from today? What are the characteristics, what the parties should focus on, that on the end of this period of 2020, they are better and more reflection of what do they exist for? So,
Okay.
Gary.
In terms of the internet and social media and where is that going politically, you know, in its day and time, the pencil was a dramatic technological improvement upon what came before it, because it allowed the dissemination of information beyond one person speaking directly to the other. The internet is that an exponential level, and if politics is about power, information is power as well. And the two come together. In my mind. There was reference to President Obama's campaign. He harnessed the power of the internet. It's how he raised money to sustain his campaign. It is how he got his message out. American politicians generally learned the lesson of his campaign. All of his consultants back then now have their own companies offering their services to the current round of political figures. So I view the more information, the better. The more access to information, the better it is. I tend to trust the collective wisdom of people and the individual wisdom of people if they have the opportunity to get information to be able to make basic decisions. The internet helps us do this. Social media can be an echo chamber, however. And as I was mentioning earlier, if you self-segregate yourself either physically or intellectually, you're doing yourself a disservice. So some people don't like to question things and they will migrate towards the echo chamber. Others want to be exposed to new ideas and new information. The internet is also going to allow the formation of very rapidly moving, very rapidly evolving organizations that respond to issues that arise. The internet will tend to blur sovereignty in many respects because we all, not we all, but a significant number of people around the globe are concerned about climate change and have come together and are forming extra-governmental and extraterritorial organizations. You can do this now without the impediment of cost being an absolute barrier to being able to get your ideas out there. So I view these things as positive contributions, and I view them as inevitable. The internet is here, social media is here. We might as well embrace it and try to use it in the manner that suits the best purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Raymond.
Okay. Well, look, Mr. Trump is the master of Twitter at this moment. He has 5 million followers, something like that. This is also the reason why he doesn't have to spend any money and why it doesn't make sense for Bush to spend money, because it's no longer television, but it is indeed Twitter. I don't believe in the individual wisdom of the Americans as a general concept. I love the optimism of Americans, but the whole idea that America is still the city on the hill, an exception to history, and that fascism can never take root in America is complete nonsense. In the 30s, there was an important book by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which was a very ironic telling of, okay, it's happening in Europe, it can happen here as well. 50 years later, The Plot Against America by Philip Roth, the same story. America is paying the price for 40 years not educating their own people. It is organized stupidity. Now, I know that, I realize that many people here love conspiracies, so I will continue with my own conspiracy. It is organized, because can you imagine that we would have had Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, that would have Master Twitter, Trump, so many things would be there if people would be slightly more intelligent? Obviously not. I mean, there would be no Fox television, there would be not so much nonsense would not be there. So the Americans didn't invest in education. They are only interested in skills, bureaucracy, and the economy thing. It's not about individual wisdom. There are still many, many dark sides to American history, which is now coming up. Not for nothing, there is Black Lives Matter, the whole things of racism, etc., etc., etc. So they are not immune to fascism, which means that we are all in trouble if America also go into that road. According to 2020, at that time the EU will have been collapsed and we will have a third world war.
So the bottom line, are we going to be in 2020 closer to unity and diversity in the EU than today or not?
It's gone. Over. You know, it's called what we call in the Balkans, it's the Balkanization of Europe. You know what it means.
Yeah. So since it's gone, it can only be better, right? Okay. Now, Mr. Berger.
Well, I think we are talking about what will be the main issues in about 5 years' time, and I think it's quite clear and most likely that the economic crisis, the financial crisis will linger on, and we will certainly not have solved that in 5 years' time. The climate issue is also something that will be very high on the agenda. And I will mention a third issue, which is integration. How do we learn to live together in Europe with people with different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds? This is a major issue, I think, now for Europe, and it will certainly be the same in 5 years' time.
Well, thank you. We have two questions already prepared from the floor, and I was advised by Ismail not to open the competition against lunch because it is practically waiting. So be careful. Mr. Badawi and Professor.
I have a question and remark. The question is, Professor Jones, about, excuse our ignorance about the differences in parties, but can you identify three major differences between Democrats and Republicans? This is my question. As a remark to Mr. Rob, that he mentioned that in spite of the higher education standard that everybody are looking to, yet the output of these universities, there are fascistic moves all over Europe, and all the crises that we see are coming out of those graduates. I would like just to mention that the goals of higher education and universities are welfare, order, meaning, and truth. And the welfare and order are the functions done by universities, but the meaning and the truth are not done. And let me read one paragraph of a beautiful say of our important writer and cultured and leader of education, Dr. Taha Hussein. He said, 1939, "It is not just a scientist who is created inside a university, but indeed a cultured, civilized man who does not just want to be cultured, but is keen to be a source of culture. He does not just want to be civilized, but is keen to be a developer of civilization. If a university achieves none of these two goals, it is not worthy being called a university, but is indeed nothing more than a modest school. It is then not created to be a beacon of light for humanity in which they are located in, but it becomes just a factory preparing for mankind a group of workers with limited hopes and limited capabilities who can achieve limited good and carry out limited reforms."
Just explained why there are no universities anymore. It's over.
Okay, let's collect just briefly the questions. We will answer at once. I mean, not at once, but I mean, we'll answer together. So please, Dr. El-Badawi.
I would like to raise a question with Professor Girold about the concept and the definition of sovereignty. Because with social media, with the internet, if we even projecting what we will have by year 2020 on a global level, it's not the border as it was in the past. It is the influence which come even across the border, not only transboundary, but through this media. And therefore, we need to look at the definition of sovereignty and how it is going to be.
Dr. Van Ginkel?
I am missing is, in fact, the relation between challenge and trust. Churchill was a backbencher until the war started. The goal would never have been the goal unless there had been the Second World War and then the Algerian crisis. So, to become a member of a political party is a relatively dull activity. Less than 2% of a cohort becomes a member of a party. Why should they? I know universities pretty well from the inside. The best are not going to become members of parties. They are going to do different things. So a major problem for the parties is how to profile themselves so that the best become members of the parties. That's, I think, a crucial a problem we have to cope with. And nowadays we really see that many people that go into parties work as bureaucracies. To come forward in a party is a very difficult thing. And the people coming forward in this common expression of wills in parties are not the best people that ever became members of the party. So how can we make it more challenging so that we can trust the difficult tasks to the people coming forward? And even I think the election process in the US shows that not the best people are at the moment running.
Professor, I hope you won't mind if we have Madam before because of gender balance, okay?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to comment on the fact that demographics, several of the gentlemen talking in the previous session, and I believe in that one, mentioned about the demographics of the young people within the Arab countries being over 60% under the age of 40. You mentioned technology and the effect of technology on democracy. I have to, I'm sorry I did not mention that in the previous session, but I have to say that a very interesting demographic in our new Egyptian parliament is that over 40% are beneath the age of 40 in our new parliament, and that by default will create change. Social media will be a way to create change within even parliaments. And as the professor just mentioned now, I believe the new form of parties will use technology into the creation of the new shape. And that's just a general comment about a future of democracy being surrounded around the virtual world and the new even principles of trust and of respect and of democracy within a virtual sense. Thank you very much.
Well, I have a short question to Mr. Riemann and then a comment on Professor Jones. My question, your talk is very interesting with all these philosophical quotations and remarks. But what is you going to do with this growing extreme right-winged parties, sort of Nazi parties, which now are a part of the government in the one of the northern European countries? I know that Mr. Bjorn Borg touched on this, but I want a philosophical answer. And to Mr. Professor John, you are very sure that Mr. Trump will not win the nomination of the Republican Party, but I would like to remind you it was Barry Goldwater who won the nomination in a rather similar situation many years ago.
Okay, I know Ismail is going to democratically kill me, but we have to collect 3 short questions. Of course, first one, my colleague and friend Boris Tadic. President Tadic, please.
If we are taking into the consideration fact that traditional parties are not going to exist anymore, if information is a power, if social medias are about power, where is going to be power in practical terms in the future? In medias, social medias, or political parties and governments?
President Tadic, Madam, please.
Thank you. My question is to Mr. Berg. Suppose that one of the extremist party, the Nationalist Party, comes to power in a European country. What would be the European Council's reaction? Thank you.
And last but not the least question.
It's for you.
I'm sorry, pre-last. And then we have last one.
My question is for you as chair. At the opening, you appeared to laugh off.
Pardon?
At the opening, it felt like you laughed off Dr. Sarah Gelden's idea of the role of randomly selected juries deliberating. Yet as I listened to each presenter, I looked at Rob's ideal for education. Surely it's easier to educate a sample of 100 people and rather than 300 million people. As I listened to Professor Jones and I thought of the rise of Donald Trump, public opinion, in 30 seconds he can convince people of anything. But in 30 hours, deliberating for a small sample, I think he'd find it much harder to convince them. So my question is simply, I agree that an extreme statement to replace elected officials is far too extreme, but as a complementary group, additional and alongside elected officials, would your view change?
So just a small question. You were talking, Professor Jones, you were talking about the extremism that's developing in America and the European presenters saying the same thing. In Australia, we have a device that you are required by law to turn up at a polling place and take your ballot paper. You don't actually have to vote, but you have to turn up. And that has had the impact of not solving all problems, but it has driven politics to the middle, because over 90% of people turn up, therefore politics is moderated and mediated by that device. And I'm just wondering why that very excellent development in Australia has not taken root elsewhere.
Okay, we are closing the questions. Now, please, answers.
It's an excellent idea, and I hope the seeds of that idea get planted and start to grow, because as I mentioned in my opening, the average American is much closer to the center than the political parties are. So if we can come up with methodologies and processes that allow that voice to be heard, almost compelled to be heard, I think we'll be better. On the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, that's a difficult question. You know, if you read but not listened to some of the State of the Union addresses or the inaugural addresses of various Democratic and Republican presidents, you would see a tremendous amount of similarity, in particular between President Reagan and President Clinton. Very similar themes many, many times, and if you remove the voice and look at the words, there's a lot of similarity, which kind of validates my view that the Americans agree on 80% of the things, and then we disagree on 20 or 30%, round numbers, and the parties kind of play into that. The Democrats try to be much more inclusive. They were more inclusive, for instance, with the adoption of the 19 Civil Rights Act, when President Johnson said this will cost the Democrats the South. It took a generation, but it did cost the Democrats the South. The South is completely Republican now in terms of elected officials. In my state, we have no federal officials elected as Democrats. They control the legislature and they control the governor's office after the Democrats controlled basically since the time of the Civil War. So inclusion versus exclusion is one. And that's manifested itself in a number of different ways. The Affordable Health Care Act is a good demonstration of the differences between the two political parties. There are differences with respect to fiscal policy and taxation. I could be cute and say that the Republicans want a balanced budget, but they have to elect a Democratic president to get it, to kind of restrain themselves. In terms of the question on sovereignty, a very, very important issue. You know, President Carter, towards the end of his presidency, said, we generally know how to deal with conflicts between countries. When one country invades another, other countries come and do something about it. Yet we do not know how to deal with civil wars within the sovereignty of one country. And sovereignty is something that gets changed many times when there is an advancement in methods of communication. Let's look back to the time of the Gutenberg press and what happened all of a sudden after the Gutenberg press. And there were clashes as a result of things that got to be printed and spread across Europe. The Internet's kind of the modern equivalent of the Gutenberg press in its day. So I think what we may see is obviously there needs to be forms of government for security, forms of government for infrastructure and things of that nature. So I don't think that sovereignty is going to go away by any means at all. And sovereignty is also a way of kind of self-selecting the group that you want to be affiliated with. But then there's the concept of being able to really affiliate with who you want to affiliate with. And consider if 500 million people came together on an issue and each kicked in $10 and said, now we're going to do something about this issue. Is that another form of sovereignty? Taking an issue that perhaps the political process has not been able to deal with itself. And on the sortition issue, you know, sometimes there are issues that the political process has a very difficult time of dealing with. In the United States, at the end of the Cold War, we had all these military bases that we didn't need anymore. But you know what? Every congressman wanted that military base to stay open in their district. You know, my runway is as good as your runway, and we're going to have to keep them both so that our constituents will vote us. So that issue was kind of taken out of the political process and put into an independent commission, and the independent commission was educated about whose air base is better than the other air base, for instance. And the rules were that whatever came out of that was going to get voted up or down, yay or nay, and you couldn't jigger with it. And that's kind of an example sometimes of bringing in experts into the process and saying, you know what, this is too political of an issue to let politics decide it, and let's use that. So I think there is room within the system to do some of that. And I'm sorry, there's so many questions. I could be here for a day or so I'll just stop at that point.
I will address two questions. First, Professor van Ginkel, it's a fact. The best people are not going into politics. I mean, they can spend their time much better. Why? Because at the very moment you enter politics, why is that people enter politics? You know, that's a way to make career. In the Netherlands, unfortunately, my former prime minister is not here, but you have to have a card of a party to make your career. Without that card membership, you cannot make any career in the public world. So that's for you conform to party discipline, you will never speak your mind. In these, they train you not even to use your mind. So this is why Simone Weil is right. You know, parties are there to make you stupid and just to be obedient and to make a nice career. This is also the reason why the best people are going to NGOs, because NGOs are still, you know, there for general interest. So at the very moment that parties understand that they are not there to serve their own interest, but there to serve general interest, they may have a chance. Concerning the question of Professor Mohammed, there is no philosophical answer to the world of fascism, but there is something intellectuals can do and there's something that politicians can do. What intellectuals have to do, and I'm a humble intellectual, we have to speak the truth. So I wrote a book on the eternal return of fascism. I sent it to all members of parliament and to our cabinet to inform them, look, Mr. Wilders is a fascist. Know what you're dealing with. But they completely ignored it. They gave him the red carpet. They hugged him a lot. And now he is salonveeg. Now he's completely accepted by the establishment. And okay. The same, again, is happening in America. Mr. Ryan, the Speaker of the House, when he was asked the question, if Mr. Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, will you vote for him, yes or no? And he said, yes, I will vote for him. So he's also a liar, right? And you're only somebody when you can speak the truth and say, look, there are certain limits which I, as a politician, will never be able to accept. But he will accept. As many of them will accept. At the very moment Trump is there, opportunism will take over, it will prevail, and there goes the whole thing.
Yes, very quickly then. I think Professor El Feki, you asked if an extremist party comes to power. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry, you're just sitting there. Okay. No, in Europe today, what we will do, and the Council of Europe as such, is to hold them accountable to the values and the standards as defined in the European Convention of Human Rights. Because they are stipulated clear standards and values that all European countries has to uphold. And we have monitoring mechanisms, and we also have a court, the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. And that court will come with judgments that all member states are obliged to execute. So this is the safety valve that we have in Europe, as a matter of fact, to meet such situation. And it's quite unique globally too, I think. It's only in Europe where we have this rather comprehensive convention system with the Convention of Human Rights, with the monitoring mechanisms, and with the court on top. And that is a safety valve for all of us, I think.
Okay, in conclusion, I would just want to thank to everyone. Of course, just to briefly touch a question that was given to me. We are obviously today putting more questions than answers, and that's logical. But the first step to start to having an answer is to know right questions. And we opened some paths that are possible. We saw some dangerous, and we saw some realities that are not in front of us that are dangerous. I don't know, I mean, the best way to end something is to quote someone who is officially smart, and who was already mentioned maybe. Marshall McLuhan, a billion years ago, used to say that there are no passengers on spaceship Earth, we are all crew. And technology gives us possibility that actually he becomes right, that we all become a crew. Then, of course, the question is, was Churchill just cynical when he was saying the best argument against democracy is 5 minutes conversation with the average voter? I don't know. I don't know, was he only cynical? But then it comes to the question that was given directly to me about, I wasn't laughing when I was mentioning, I mean, this idea about jury. Maybe, I think this was a very serious one, and that's the reason why I wanted to meet Jerry in here to talk intensely about it, because I think it's very, very interesting idea. And if it will not replace, that it may be additional tool, because we are entering into time in which political parties are no more owners of political space. We're entering into time when political parties will be stronger as much as they get connected with other stakeholders in society. And the political parties which will survive will be the only ones who collect as many stakeholders in their camp, on a projects, on ad hoc basis, or whatever, but on the values that they stand for. And then I'm concluding with with one word that you mentioned, which we didn't even touch, which is education. And this all doesn't lead us nowhere unless we put more emphasis on education, because, I mean, uneducated people are perfect cases for his book. That's the reason why I will end this session with quoting H.G. Wells, who said that civilization is in a constant race in between education and catastrophe.
That's a great point. Where did you find that quote?
H.G. Wells.
Yeah, but where did you find it?